I just wanted to make an interesting point about the idea of doubt in the Quran, because actually what we're talking about is what we doubt and what we have iman in, what we're convinced about. Um, Actually, the people that, in my experience, have the most doubts about the Quran being a complete book are Muslims who follow Hadith. And what I've realized is that in order for there to be that additional notion of guidance from an additional source, there has to be, or that has to be predicated on a doubt in the initial source. So you cannot have Hadith standing on its own ground as long as the Quran is an independent entity. So actually the primary cause of this doubt came from Muslims to begin with. They had to create a doubt about the Quran in order for Hadith to exist as its own separate entity of guidance. If the Quran stands on its own, then it throws into disrepute this idea that there has to be an alternative source of guidance in order to interpret the Quran. The other thing is that, when we talk about doubt and certainty, implicit in a lot of the questions that have gone before is that somehow historical narratives possess some sort of certainty about them, and scientific narratives possess some sort of certainty about them. But what the Quran talks about cannot be certain unless justified again by an external interpretation of science or historicism, which I think is a bizarre interpretation, because when we look at history and we look at the many, many and varied ways in which history is presented to us, there is nothing but doubt in history. And now that we look at science as well, just by saying something is scientific, or that there is a science of, say, Hadith or something like that, this is actually just sophistry. Like, what that is this desire to use rational or logical arguments in order to justify something's truth externally, without actually looking at what the text says and what the text itself proclaims, and then interpreting that as reasonable or unreasonable. Iman, and the beauty of Iman, is that the conviction comes from the text itself. So the reason that we, or many of the people in this group, agree with much of what Allama Pervez has written is because what he did was he presented the goals of the Quran from the outset. He said that the Quran promises new life in the individual. It promises material success in this life. It promises power, and it promises immaterial success in life after death. It also promises unification of hearts and minds, and it promises the removal of fear and grief from each individual. And then he outlined the source, or the path to that. So the conviction in Iman comes from actually grasping that path, grasping the theoretical ideas, and then practicing them, as was stated many times in the presentation today, that actually going forward with that, and then realizing that this book, what it says will come true, does come true after a degree of patience and perseverance. This does start happening. That conviction, that certainty that I have gone forward and actually and practice what I preached, which is one of the verses we spoke about in 61 too, and then realize the truth of it myself. That certainty is something very distinct from an external narrative, be it that of Hadith, scientific inquiry, or historicism of any sort. Someone else telling me that through this or that method, this or that scientific method, they've come to some conclusion, will always have some degree of doubt within it. But it speaks to that other question of coming to the Quran with our own preconceived notions, because actually embedded in that question is that I don't have a degree of certainty that what the Quran has proclaimed is true, but I would have more certainty if some atheist, or someone associated or affiliated with some sort of scientific institution came along and said, I've done some degree of research, and then concluded that this is the Book of Allah. That would provide me more certainty than me actually going forward to the Quran and interpreting it and figuring out what it says for myself. And what that does is it highlights that our doubt is primarily in that what Allah promises can come true can it actually come true? That's the doubt. And we're more certain that if some other person came along and promised us that this is, scientifically sound, that would convince us more than actually going and grasping what Allah says and then actually going and practicing it. But remember that doubt in the Quran is the prerequisite for shirk. So we have to understand that you cannot have a complete entity standing on its own feet, being independent of all other sources. That then you have to have a weakness in that in order to then have something outside, externally interpreting or shedding light on it. It's that space, so it's that doubt or shakiness in its foundations that allows for our projection of our own ideas into it. And whether people do this willingly or unwillingly, there is no doubt that either they do it willingly and they calculatedly decide in some conspiratorial notion that we're going to calculatedly make some doubts about the Quran and then introduce our own ideas to it, or they do it through self-deception and convince themselves that somehow they're working something righteous. But either way, the outcome is the same, that what they're doing is they are starting with doubts in the Quran and its completeness, and then allowing or using that space, using that criticism, using that doubt to then encourage other interpretations, things from outside. The beauty of what Allama Pervez did, and we're not following Allama Pervez, he just started this journey. He reignited this light which was dead for over 1,000 years. And what he did was he decided that he's going to use the Quranic guidance, the Quran's own proclamation. How should it be understood? And it says the Quran should be understood through its own words. It should be cross-referenced and related to itself. Concepts should be constructed, and using concepts, ideas should be understood more clearly. He did that, and he laid it out clearly at the foundational level, which is what was really interesting. What Manzoor Malik said earlier, Brother Malik said earlier, was that, that was the foundation. And here we're establishing very, very fundamental concepts. But once these concepts are then reapplied back to the Quran, back to those more allegorical verses, we'll see that actually there are oceans and oceans of knowledge within this text. The difference between that interpretation and everyone else's interpretation is that all the other interpretations are predicated on the idea that the Quran cannot be understood using its own words and needs something outside to understand it. And what happens to those interpretations is they're extremely limited in how much breadth they can accumulate before they run out of steam. And the second thing is that when you actually practice those interpretations, you are materially outcompeted by everyone else around you, which is what we see with Muslims today. The so-called Muslim Ummah today is materially outcompeted by atheists, Christians, and Jews, because they've introduced other ideas into the Quran, which they did so because they doubted its own standing, its own independent standing. So whatever conclusion you come to at the end of this, the point that I'm making is that if you conclude that there's any doubt in the Quran and its independence, then you will be, and then you introduce something external. You don't just abandon the whole Muslim cause. You still pursue this. You still pursue this interpretation as some other notion. You will be materially outcompeted by everyone else, because that's what the Quran says has happened to people who do shirk. And that's not a criticism, not accusing anyone of doing anything like that. But the technical meaning of that term is the introduction of external influences into the Quranic interpretation. The beauty of Allama Pervez's work was at a foundational level. He did not do that in any respect. He never introduced an external interpretation into the Quran. He always interpreted the Quran primarily from its own words and only ever used external sources to bolster that, just to give it a bit of color. But the primary source is always the Quran's own words, and that's what we're doing on this platform. Anyway, that was my point. I don't think we should pursue this discussion any further because it's already taken a lot of time, but I just wanted to add that. Thank you.